G'day Sports by Fry fans, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Sports by Fry YouTube channel. I'm back here recapping round 20 in the AFL Fantasy world. We've only got 3 weeks left of the 2019 season. A lot of people have given up hope on their fantasy teams, but believe it or not, there are some coaches still out there playing for meaningful league spots, meaningful ranking. Maybe you're in the conversation for a hat or two. And of course, draft leagues are still going on around the world as well. Round 20 saw some pretty massive scores, both from teams and players alike. So without further ado, let me dive into exactly what happened in the round 20 wrap-up. First things first, I have to go through my team. I actually posted a pretty good score this weekend. Third highest score of my career, a whopping 24.63. I was pretty impressed when I saw it on paper, but it didn't actually move me up a hell of a lot. I think I moved up maybe 1,500 spots, which glass half full is in the right direction, which is something more than I can say in recent times. But yeah, it wasn't too great. Hopefully I can keep putting up some big numbers to close out the year and crack the top 15, maybe even the top 10,000. Starting in defense, my defenders, as per usual, were pretty consistent. Couple of 80s from the likes of Clark and Blakely. Blakely on debut for Sydney Stack. Hopefully he can keep putting up some higher numbers. I don't want to get too greedy, but an 80 is alright. I'd love a 90 or 100. Speaking of 100, Lockie Whitfield looked much like the number one defender that he is. I'm calling it now. Sorry, Jake Lloyd. Scored 115 on the week. Lloydie was probably only about 10, 20 points behind him in the 90s. Brodie Smith turned up for me, which was nice to see. I did trade in Carter, and he scored 47, I think, on my bench, so nothing too terrible. Big shout out, though, to Rory Laird for his 134. Highest score of the season. I kind of, not threw him under the bus, but gave him a bit of a rev up. He hasn't gone over 120 yet this year. I think he might do it back-to-back weeks. Speaking of going over 120, Adam Treloar, Mr. Consistency, got it done again. I did consider making him my skipper, but didn't follow through. Jack McRae was a few points better than him with a massive 151, round high 151, so well done there, McRae. Across the board, I got tons from the likes of Merritt and Eagles, Shuey and Gaff. Duncan and Taranto are a little bit lackluster, but it is what it is. It kind of balanced out with Will Snelling, who would usually get me a 60. He got to a 90 odd. So if I take a couple of points off him and throw it on the other two in Taranto and Duncan, it all balances out. It was nice to see Kyle Dunkley back in the side and got a 70 odd for me as my emergency. Hopefully he can hang around and just sit in that spot to close the year. My captain, though, this week was none other than Brodie Grundy. Failed me last week, stuck with the man, even though he was going up against a pretty formidable foe in Jared Witts, and he got the job done. Big 145, so thank you, Brodie Grundy. Max Gawn, we thought that Braden Pruce would have a bit of an effect on his score, and he did, but Gawn still got to 100, so I'm not too depressed with that. And lastly, up forward, things were meh in my forward line. There wasn't anything too amazing. James Worpel is probably the lone standout with a 126, but I had to settle for 90s and 100s, just average across the board from everyone else. And speaking of average, Patrick Dangerfield didn't really fire against Freo like a lot of people thought he would, and sucked as a bit of a captain option as well. Only scored a 60 odd, so could maybe come under scrutiny and be on the chopping block. I wouldn't get too crazy, but definitely warrants it. So yeah, 24.63. Pretty decent number. Hopefully I can keep up the high scoring streak in around at 21. Injury issues time now. The biggest injury news is probably surrounding Grant Birchall. Not in a ton of fantasy teams, but those people who do own Grant Birchall will have to look for a trade because unfortunately he hurt his hamstring again on Friday night, and it might honestly be the last time that we see the 4-time Premiership Hawk. Hopefully not. I've always been a big favourite of Grant Birchall, so hopefully he can get back on the park, but there's no guarantees. Hamstrings were the flavour of the week once again. Dane Zorko wasn't really sure how serious his injury was at the time. Hurt his hamstring against the Bulldogs and straight away put it on ice. But good news came out today that Zorko's a chance to play against Gold Coast and the injury's not too serious. His former teammate Dane Beams has been on the sidelines for a while, and we know now that he's going to miss the rest of the season. He's had a hip issue that's sidelined him since around the byes, but this shoulder surgery he's now having is going to end his season effectively. We thought he'd be out for the rest of the fantasy season, but his 2019 is done. Same can be said for his current teammate in Mason Cox. Has a torn retina in his eye, which sounds bloody painful. So hopefully Coxie's all right, but yeah, he's going to miss the rest of the season. And one bloke who has been under an injury cloud for a few weeks that we could see come back is Josh Kelly. He's missed a month of footy, and like the traders pointed out on their podcast the other night, he has missed a month with a calf. So coming back on a Friday night in Canberra against Hawthorn, where it's going to be nice and cold, probably doesn't sound like the safest scenario coming back from a calf injury. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was rested one more week, but he's definitely a chance this weekend. Turning my attention straight into some trade tactics. Now, I didn't point out any midfielders in my trade tactics this time because most people will be rocking with a complete midfield. And if you are looking at a midfield trade or a swap, I definitely advise checking out Cal's scale of hardness on the Dream Team Talk site. Talks a little bit about what you should expect from players in the next 3 games, what their opponents are like, what points they give up, etc., etc. Take it with a grain of salt because a lot of times these numbers tend to not be too relevant, but there's definitely some merit in reading through them. So that's where I'd probably steer your midfield trades this week. However, there is a clear forward trade target, none other than Toby Green. Over 5,000 people brought him in for his 146 this week, and if Josh Kelly does miss again, we could see Matt De Boer maybe eat into some of his midfield time, but I think it's more an issue for Zach Williams over Green. Green, probably the form player of the comp right now. He had 115 not too long ago. I think from memory he even had a 120 the week before, so definitely a trade target and someone you might want to consider as a Jack Zeeble replacement. Down back, if you need help, Rory Laird is your go-to man. A lot of coaches will have Rory Laird in their side already, but those that don't should probably bring him in. Like I said, he had 134 on the weekend, and he's going up against West Coast, who just gave up 135 to Nick Newman. I think from memory, Cade Simpson had a 90 on against him as well. Wiedering even had a handful of marks, so definitely a trade target is Rory Laird. If you're looking at rookies, I don't think it's wise to pay up top dollar, well, not even top dollar really, but I think you got to maximise money in the bank. So bringing in the likes of maybe Hayden McLean, Will Snelling, those popular types that have cost you nearly 300k, isn't where I would steer my trade-in targets this week. I'd rather look at someone like Jason Carter, who should hold his spot in Freo's outfit after their win against Geelong. Only had a 40-odd, but if he's on your bench, you probably only need a little heartbeat option like him. Hugh Goddard falls in this category as well. Hasn't really had the greatest fantasy scoring numbers and could get dropped, but those two or any other 170k players who are named, I think is fine to trade in and maybe just stick as a bench emergency for a week or two because, let's be honest, that's all we've got left in this season. I've talked about these guys for weeks now, but if you still own Jack Zeeble and or James Sicily, they have to go. Zeeble needed 3 goals to get his 90 on the weekend, and even though Luke Davies-Uniacke is now out injured for the rest of the year, we could see Zeeble maybe play a few more midfield minutes. I think it's wise to pull the trigger and get him out. He hasn't been the same player since Sean Higgins has come back into the team, so he's got to go. Similar with Sicily, we've seen his stock plummet in the last month or so. He's only had 1 fantasy ton since the buys, so he has got to go in my opinion. Doesn't cost a hell of a lot, but you have to move him on, otherwise you're going to be stuck with a Angus Brayshaw 2.0 scenario. And sticking with the theme of keeping a lot of money generating, you might want to try and trade out the likes of Bewley from your benches now, Jared Cameron, Oscar Baker, those rookies that have made enough money. They might still be playing and earning their roles, and by no means do you have to trade out playing emergencies, but I think if you want to maximise money to get some of these big names, maybe you don't have enough cash to turn Zeeble into Toby Green, you can do that by trading out someone I've already talked about, maybe even Nick Hind. He falls into this category as well, and throwing that money on top of one of those underperformers and cashing in while you can. Waiver wire moves, draft finals are well and truly underway, so there's a few important players you may want to consider. Up forward, I like the looks of Jake Stringer and Cameron Zerha at the moment. Their ownership is both under about 15%, and they scored 80s and 70s respectively on the weekend. So 2 dudes that could give you some depth in your forward line, depending on the size of your league. If you are in a bigger league and there's more players on your field, chances are you won't be able to grab Sam Powell-Pepper, who had 106 on the weekend, but he's someone that I definitely recommend if he's out there. He does see his output fluctuate, but had 100 on the weekend, and depending on what the personnel around him is, does dictate his fantasy score, but he's a good depth piece. We have seen Dan Houston become fantasy relevant, especially in draft leagues over the last few weeks. He had 123 on the weekend, and again, like Powell-Pepper, is in about 30% of teams, so might not be out there to be snared, but if he is, he could add a string to your bow in defense. And if you're desperate for a ruck, Oscar McInerney, the Lions big man, is probably the only bloke out there that I'd recommend. There are a couple of other random dudes that won't score greatly, and McInerney, now that I've said this, will probably give you a 40 or a 50, but he started in the middle against the Bulldogs on the weekend, and Steph Martin started on the bench, so that's good news for his potential fantasy ceiling, and I think if you're desperate, he's the best of a bad bunch. Finally, time to talk about my moves. I will probably be axing Jack Zeeble this week. I did say this last week, but got dealt an injury issue that I had to address. So hopefully Thursday night sees my team unharmed, which means that I can turn Zeeble into someone. I can empty my bank and go to Josh Dunkley. I can save 130 grand, I think it is from memory, and get Toby Green. Or I can save another 40 grand again and target someone like Tom Lynch, who I'm giving serious consideration to. I've been a big Tom Lynch fan for a while, and part of my reasoning behind that is I feel like not many people, unless you're one of them watching this video, are going to trade in Tom Lynch this week. So if I want to really rise up the ranks, I need to try and think outside the box and get someone like that. The last few weeks is when you've got to try and take a bit of a flyer on these dudes. I did so with Hunter Clark, who's been solid recently to close out the season. I've got Luke Shuey, who's definitely a unique. So might try my hand with another one and trade in Tommy Lynch. And that's going to do it for the round 20 wrap-up. Thanks again for tuning in. Make sure tomorrow you check out my Dream Team Talk Cash Cows piece. Even though rookies aren't priority at the moment, I'm going to start handing out some awards, and I need you guys to vote for them as well. But otherwise, again, thanks for watching. I'll be back for the round 21 wrap-up next week. Good luck in your fantasy finals matchups. Until next time, peace.